Tuesday. What we are going to be doing today is covering 5 issues regarding current topics in genetic research. We are going to be exploring each of those debates, much like you explored your own science or technological controversies. And we are going to be covering them from a number of different viewpoints, looking at different arguments, and of course, discussing some key ideas. I mentioned to you the entire class discussion is something you should consider for your final exam question or one of your major final exam questions. And that's why the more you talk, the more everyone knows and the better everyone's going to do. Conversely, nobody talks, nobody knows anything, everybody's got to do it on their own. That's the way it is. So, I'm going to guide you through the first of our discussion points. We will get through the 5 together. I will then go through 2 legal case studies with you, and then talk to you a little bit about your final exam, and if there are any questions, you can ask me then. So the first place we want to start is with mandatory genetic testing. Now, as I mentioned to you before, when we talk about this idea of mandatory genetic testing, we are talking about an issue that really has different ideas associated with it. The first, should, for example, a country require its citizens to undergo a mandatory genetic test? Therefore, it's not voluntary, so to speak. And the other idea is whether or not these tests should then be made available to groups like insurance companies or, for instance, employers. Now, the first area that I want to look at this issue from is from the individual perspective. And one of the good ways of thinking about this entire class today is to realize that each and every one of these issues is, in fact, going to be an issue that will probably impact each and every one of you. These are not futuristic ideas. They are not going to be happening decades down the road. Many of these ideas are already, for example, very much a part of society today. Think of yourself, for instance, at a policy table. You now have an issue to deal with, and you have many different people at that policy table with different perspectives. And we can clearly see this just by looking at the individual perspective alone. For example, when we talk about this idea of mandatory genetic testing, the first thing that I want you to consider is the individual response, the individual's response. And right away, we can see, for instance, 2 very different types of scenarios result. For example, if an individual is required to undergo a mandatory genetic test, and they find out, for instance, that they are going to be susceptible, and that's a key word to consider in our story today, if they find out they're going to be susceptible to a particular genetic disease, they are probably going to have one of 2 reactions. What might those reactions be? So one, for example, negative reaction might be panic, anxiety, depression. This idea, for instance, that the disease itself is going to come, that there is nothing that they can do about it. And right away, we get into this issue then of why the notion of susceptibility is so important to understand. What does susceptibility mean?
Ability to get it.
Pardon?
Capacity to get it, or
it's your capacity or your likelihood to get it. But for a lot of people, what are they going to confuse susceptibility with?
That they are going to get it.
Inevitability. They're going to confuse susceptibility with inevitability, and that can be a very dangerous path to follow when we talk about these genetic tests. Remember, most genetic tests do not tell you whether you are going to get a disease 100% for sure. They tell you your susceptibility, your likelihood. But for most people, they don't make that clear-cut distinction. And all of a sudden, they being told there's a likelihood of, let's say, getting cancer means there's an inevitability associated with it. That comes with negativity, negative feelings, feelings of anxiety, and remorse. That's 50% of you in this room. What's the other 50% thinking?
The positive view, where you take a proactive approach, make sure you get regular medical testing, alternatives, or treatments, or whatever.
So for some individuals, they take a completely or have a completely different reaction. They take this and look at it positively. Perhaps this brings about great life changes, lifestyle changes, choices in the way they conduct their own health, their diet. They do everything they can to ensure, for instance, a better quality of life down the road. Same issue, different reaction. let's look at it also when we talk about an individual from, let's say, a social perspective. If you were living in a country, for instance, where every single citizen was required to undergo a genetic test, what particular aspect of one's social life could be impacted by this? Well, there would be privacy issues, and we're talking about the social aspect where?
There might be a risk of isolation if they don't like the news, if they don't like the fact that if they find out that they are susceptible and they don't ring the bell, so they might socially isolate themselves from their job, their family, their friends.
So social isolation is one thing,
They might be discriminated against by other
and
people.
well, we'll talk about this idea of discrimination in a few minutes. It's an important one to consider. But when we talk about particular areas of your social life, think for a minute, marriage and children. How could this type of knowledge impact this particular area?
Well, for example, you would want to pass on a certain trait to your offspring, so divorces would be,
Or even before it gets to that stage, say you consider you want to marry someone. You know you live in a country where everybody has access to these tests. So perhaps before you actually go to or through with that stage of marriage, you ask your potential fiance or potential spouse to show them your tests so you can see whether or not you are a genetic match. Not an unlikely scenario if all of these tests, for example, were to be housed or to be found within the same country. Now let's talk about an individual in reaction to other groups and get into this issue of discrimination a little bit more. First, let's start with insurance companies. Now when we talk about insurance companies, we are talking about groups or a business in particular that probably has one of the biggest stakes at the policy table. Why, for instance, have insurance companies in the past and even today continued to maintain this idea that they have every right to see or make you take a genetic test?
Because if they do find out that you're susceptible, they can increase your premium, they can increase the cost of insurance, and it's all in they have the power to do it.
So this is one outcome. They have the power to either increase your insurance or do what else?
Not insure you at all.
Deny you access to insurance altogether. So insurance companies, for instance, for a very long time have in fact been doing this. They see the test results. They then either charge you extraordinarily high premiums, again, based on susceptibility, not necessarily inevitability, or they refuse you insurance altogether. But let's go back to why insurance companies can make the claim this information is extremely important to them as a business. What is the one word, keyword, associated with insurance companies as a whole? What is their entire situation based on?
Risk.
Risk and risk management.
They want to treat people like a car. Sports car would get more insurance because somebody got bad genes, versus others.
Every single person is assessed on risk or risk management. And for them, they would state that the more information they have about an individual, then the better they can assess this notion of risk management. So clearly, insurance companies have been playing a huge role in this whole issue of genetic testing. What about employers, the everyday average business? They might have many different reasons for wanting a potential employee to undergo a mandatory genetic test. What might these reasons be?
Maybe if you're working in a job that might provide more risk factors for developing certain diseases, if you have a genetic predisposition for those, they might not want you to get that because then they might pay you like employers comp or whatever later.
So two issues here. First, think about the nature of certain jobs. If you're going into a job in construction, it requires you to have exposure to dangerous or hazardous environments. Maybe you're not necessarily a viable candidate, or the employee doesn't think you're a viable candidate simply because your susceptibility to certain diseases is going to make you more likely to get sick. And if you're more likely to get sick, that impacts the bottom line of these businesses as well. Not only, for example, does it impact their health insurance costs, as we just mentioned, what else does it do? What's another area associated with economics?
They might have to pay for like sick leaves and stuff, so they
Sick-
have to get somebody else to work for them and hiring extra employees.
Sick days, time off.
Actually, I was gonna say, might sound mean, but, it's the investment in the employee, so if I'm investing, paying for their, their MBA, and 5 years on the road, that, they might croak, I wouldn't wanna make that investment, so.
And so for many employers, they see it, for example, again, as investing in an asset, and therefore they want to choose the best asset for that particular occupation. However, think now for a minute that you're an individual who's undergone a genetic test. You find out you're susceptible or predisposed to certain kinds of genetic traits or genetic diseases, and you find yourself now being denied access to something like healthcare, or being forced to pay extraordinarily high premiums, or even worse, you are now found to have lost a potential job opportunity because of said test results. What would a lot of people feel on the basis of this? What was the word we just talked about? Discrimination. The issue of, in this case, genetic discrimination. Who can tell me here, and let's have lots of different people talking, remember. What is genetic discrimination? Why is genetic discrimination the same as gender discrimination or racial discrimination? What makes it the same thing?
You don't have control over your genes just the same way you don't have control over your gender or race.
You don't have control over your genes the way you don't have control over race, the way you don't have control over gender. There is no control over your genes. So to be denied access to a job or insurance has been considered by many to be a clear-cut case of discrimination. In fact, take a look here. You don't have to read the fine print, the headlines tell you enough. This 2009 study showed, for instance, that in Canada, individuals with a susceptibility to something like Huntington's disease have been unjustly discriminated against by insurance companies. Again, here, we have to consider the notion of susceptibility. There is an increased likelihood they're going to get this disease. It doesn't mean they're actually going to get it, but as a result, these are individuals who have been denied access to insurance or have been forced to face extremely high rates as a result. For those of you who don't believe, for instance, that this idea of employers discriminating against individuals has been happening, it's actually been happening for decades. Ever since, for instance, these techniques have come about from projects like the Human Genome Project. And in fact, it was just in the last 2 years or so where the United States actually enacted legislation to try to combat this issue. Legislation which unfortunately we still don't necessarily have in Canada. What legislation, or piece of legislation, was passed in the United States about 2.5 years ago now?
I have that the Genetic Information Discrimination Act of 2000, it says 2005.
It's a little older than 2005, but it's okay. Well, Obamacare is part of it, but it's actually this GINA Act, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, that was passed to actually prevent individuals from being discriminated against by insurance companies and employers. An increasing trend that was in fact happening in the United States.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, the GINA Act. So here you have the example of a country which has actually taken legal action against this very important issue of genetic discrimination. Telling you again, this is an issue which people have been confronting for a very long time. Now moving back to our board here, let's talk about other groups and their potential feelings on mandatory genetic testing. Let's look at the government, for example. Why would a government be very interested in having access to the genetic tests of its entire population? What would be in it for them? So one thing would be, again, about business or money. You can see money plays a pretty big role in a lot of these arguments. The economic aspect of this needs to be taken into account. If you're a country You start to spot trends within your population. You start to see, for example, diseases which are affecting more of the population than others. Then maybe you use this information as a way of allocating your healthcare cost. We also now need to think about this information within different kinds of governments as well. Compare, for example, for a minute, Canada and the United States. Now in Canada, we have access to what is called universal health care, which means that everyone can go to a doctor essentially if they're sick for the most part. But now put yourself in the shoes of an individual living in the United States. If you lived in the United States, theoretically, and theory is often different from practice, but theoretically, what socioeconomic group might benefit from the idea of a mandatory genetic test? And why?
Obviously, wealthy people.
Well, wealthy people already have money and access to these kinds of tests. So let's actually look at it from the opposite point of view.
Because the government can fund money into diseases that more people are susceptible.
Well, the money would be funded by the government to have these individuals take these tests. They would be mandatory, they would be required. So for the first time, you might have individuals who have access to opportunities to take these kinds of tests to better ascertain exactly where their health is. However, go back to theory versus practice. Because while theoretically, people from a lower socioeconomic status might have the ability to access these health tests, what would they likely not be able to do afterwards? Or pay for anything associated with healthcare. Maybe they can't pay or afford the prescriptions, the therapy, any kind of measure to actually deal with whatever issue they have. So again, we're looking at two different things. We're looking at having access to information versus the reality of what happens when you get this information as well. Now, that leads us to a very interested group on the board here, the pharmaceutical industry, of course. When we talk about the pharmaceutical industry, we are talking about a group that plays a big role in this as well. Why would pharmaceutical companies be very interested in, again, having access to a large population's genetic test results?
They can focus on specific treatment, the vast majority has it, or they can advertise it.
So money, again, in terms of research and development, spot trends within the population, again, figure out what the most popular diseases are, and then all of a sudden put your R&D healthcare dollars into researching those diseases.
Also, they'll probably get the contracts and stuff to actually perform the tests.
So again, they're going to make a lot of money based on the notion of these tests alone, or at least have a connection to them. But who, for example, is impacted negatively if all of a sudden most of the money is going towards the trendy or popular diseases?
Someone without, who with a different disease.
A rare disease, one that doesn't impact the population? What's the likelihood of finding a cure for those diseases, for instance, if nobody is no longer interested in necessarily looking for a potential cure? There's also another area of medicine in particular which stands to boom by this whole notion of mandatory genetic testing. And it is, again, potentially a very dangerous area to think about. What particular area of medicine could the pharmaceutical company start playing up on if all of a sudden everyone within a country was to undergo a mandatory genetic test? There's a particular word or type of medicine we're referring to, we're talking about.
Something like preventative.
Preventative medicine. And think of the dangers of preventative medicine. Preventative medicine doesn't necessarily assure you you're going to get better. Preventative medicine just gives you the pills and the therapies and the potions to say you might get better down the road. Here's a drug, it might make you better. It might make you stop getting something like cancer. It doesn't give you a guarantee. It doesn't make a promise. But what it does is give you hope. And with preventative medicine, hope becomes extremely important. What person, if they have money, is not going to try everything in their power to get better.
Well, another thing, it might end up like, if there's all this discrimination against people who have these susceptibilities, and maybe they can't get jobs and stuff like this, then they're gonna think there's gonna be all this more pressure to have like designer babies and stuff to like save your child, the discrimination.
Well, we'll get into germline gene therapy in a few minutes, and we'll talk about both the pros and cons of germline gene therapy. But interestingly enough, there's often more problems for those children than there are actual benefits. So the pharma industry stands to benefit tremendously. What about doctors? What about researchers? They're probably in favor of mandatory genetic testing for different reasons. What might those reasons be? So healthcare, generally speaking, for a doctor, they want to know everything they can about their patient. They want to be able to treat their patient in the best possible manner. So the more you know, the better off you are. What about researchers?
Well, something specific to focus on, and then it'll be easier for them to get grants, universities or governments or whatever.
So again, it's about researching certain trends in the population, something they might not necessarily be able to do now, because for the first time, what would researchers have access to? What does mandatory genetic testing give them?
They give them all the access to the community database kind of thing.
A larger genetic pool. They give them a larger amount of data to work with, something they don't necessarily have at the moment. What about the military? What might the military do? Creating a super soldier. The idea, for instance, of screening out candidates, using your genetic test to, in fact, find, for instance, the best kind of soldier out there. But what's another far more dangerous thing that could be done with genetic tests?
Targeted like chemical warfare and stuff like that, where they go after certain genes, go after those certain people.
Think of chemical or biological weapons that can be created when you have access to the genetic test results of your enemies. You find out that within your enemy population, there's a certain susceptibility to a particular genetic disease. Create a weapon that targets that disease, and then use it accordingly. Not a far-fetched scenario when we already know the kinds of technology and the kinds of knowledge that are out there, things that are being done without most of us actually even knowing it as we speak. So, if we look at all of these viewpoints for just a minute, you'll see we've actually almost covered each and every one just in this first case study alone. Individuals, governments, military, employers, employees, doctors, researchers, pharma companies, insurance companies, all of them play a role in this debate. And yet we still haven't even gone to other important aspects of this debate worth considering. For instance, what is there always going to be with any kind of medical test? There's always going to be the potential for what? Error. And what do we call the two errors associated with medical testing? False positives and false negatives. False positive says you have something but you don't really have it. A false negative says you don't have something but you really do. Now think, for example, about the problems with false positives and false negatives. First of all, with mandatory genetic testing, we're talking about the genetic testing of a large-scale population. Yes, maybe your tests are 99.9% accurate, but all of a sudden, that 1.1% becomes a lot of people when you're covering a large number of people being tested. And now, go back to that individual response. We already know that half of you in this class would likely be depressed, anxious, perhaps even suicidal upon getting the test results, especially if you were to find out your susceptibility to a genetic disease. Now, all of a sudden, combine that with the fact you actually really don't have that disease in the first place. Very dangerous paths to consider. Probably the last thing we need to focus on is security. And think about this for a minute. If every single person in a country underwent a genetic test, where would these tests be kept? Large filing cabinet somewhere else?
By the government?
By the government.
At data centers.
In databases, in computer databases. And we all know how safe computer databases actually are. When you think of financial institutions often finding people's secure financial data in garbage dumpsters, in random locations, or being stolen by enterprising individuals. All of a sudden think, for example, just how safe and secure your own genetic test results are. Maybe someone taking those test results wouldn't have an impact on you perhaps individually. They're not necessarily going to go after an individual per se, but they're probably going to stand to benefit a great deal if they were to steal this information, because what would an enterprising person do with it? They would sell it. And who would they likely sell it to? Well, some would call them that. Researchers? Pharma companies, your insurance companies, and everybody who really stands to benefit from this data. So there is your first issue. The idea of mandatory genetic testing might not be happening as we currently speak in a country like Canada on a large scale, but it's definitely happening if you graduate, you potentially want a particular job, or maybe you're out there trying to get insurance. This stuff is happening as we speak. It's something you have to be very aware of. Now let's look at issue number 2, a far more touchy subject for many, dealing with a lot of sensitive matter, but one also where we start to look at some of those key ideas on the board. In particular, genetic diversity, and slippery slope arguments in particular. The issue of the genetic testing of pregnant women is also a particularly fascinating one to consider, because one of the things our conversation will show you is that what appears to be at first glance an individual or family decision-making process actually has the potential to impact all of humankind. And that's something that we might not see right away. And it's something I want you to think about. How can everybody's individual decision impact all of the human race? There is actually the potential to do so as we start to delve into this issue. Now, when we talk about the genetic testing of pregnant women, we are talking about testing a pregnant woman to see whether or not her fetus is again going to be susceptible to a certain kind of genetic trait or genetic disease. In some cases, the results might show, for instance, that the fetus is likely to have a life-threatening disease, a very painful, degenerative disease down the road. And often then, there are options that the woman needs to consider. One option, of course, is to terminate the pregnancy. The second option is to give the baby up for adoption. And the third option is to keep the baby. Now, let's look at these options themselves to see, for example, where many of these arguments or ideas come into play. For example, what may make an individual decide, for instance, to terminate a pregnancy? What would be the feelings?
Economics, like, just because they don't have enough to support the child, but like, even if the child was like, come to be born, they're gonna like die in the near future or have a suffering in life.
So many factors to consider here. Number one, maybe they don't want to make the child suffer down the road. There is this idea, for instance, of preventing their child from suffering, ending the pregnancy before that can happen.
That ties into economics, because like, what if they don't have enough to support the child or like have, you know, the right medication to keep the child a sustainable life?
And economics is tied to other things, psychological and emotional suffering as well. People sometimes are simply not economically, psychologically, or emotionally prepared to deal with a child with special needs, one that might require a great deal of money and attention down the road. So for these individuals, there are different reasons for terminating the pregnancy, but all are equally important to them. What about deciding to keep the pregnancy or keep the pregnancy going? What might, for example, this type of information do?
Keeps you better prepared to handle the child. Like if you know that the child will have a certain disease that's not life-threatening and you're going to keep it, you're going to try to gear it towards having a better quality of life so it doesn't get that disease or can handle it better.
So again, it's about economic, emotional, psychological preparation in this case. You're preparing yourself for instance, both the hardships, but of course also rewards that might come from having a child with special needs. And having this knowledge on hand makes it a very worthwhile endeavor. Now, for a lot of people, however, the decision to keep or to terminate a pregnancy is very much based on one particular viewpoint here we have yet to consider. Religion. Here, we can clearly see religion playing a huge role in this debate. Many people are guided by their religious beliefs, their religious philosophy, and many religious institutions, for instance, are often against the idea of terminating pregnancies. So for individuals who are very much connected or tied to religion, this plays a very big role in their decision-making process.
What about like culturally? Because some cultures prefer boys over girls, and that's where like some families like,
We'll talk about that in just a few minutes because it's a very important example of our individual versus worldwide consequence. So, we have, for instance, decisions to be made. But now I'm going to keep adding layers to this decision-making process. For instance, in theory, it is a woman's choice to decide whether or not she wants to keep a pregnancy or whether or not she wants to terminate. But why, for instance, in reality, is this often far different?
Coercion from family.
Well, not necessarily just coercion, but if you're within a family unit, there's a husband, there's a wife. Both of you, for example, are part of this process in reality. And why does this then become a more complex issue? What could likely happen?
Let's say it could be a legal debate as well, as to,
Who has the rights?
of the child.
Well, who has the rights, especially when what happens?
It can cause strain between the father and mother, which can cause them divorce or.
It can cause strain. Why?
because of that disagreement.
Disagreement. One might want to keep, one might choose to terminate. So again, what appears to be an individual decision is often anything but. And all of a sudden, when there's conflict between maybe two of the major players involved, or even the family unit, as is often the case culturally, then all of a sudden you have a great deal more economic, psychological, and emotional strain happening. The other thing I want you to consider, which many people don't, is this whole idea to accessing information in the first place. And again, let's go to our 50-50 split here. Now, 50% of you in this room, if given the choice of accessing this information, might say, yes, this is something I would want. This is something I would require to make an informed decision. The more information I have, the better off I am. However, what's the other 50% of you thinking?
Whatever happens, happens.
Whatever happens, happens. I don't want that information. That information doesn't help me in any way. That information, contrary to helping me, just makes things worse for me. Because now I have to make a decision that I'm going to spend the rest of my life feeling guilty about either way. What we don't realize as a society is that, and for many individuals, having more access to information is actually more of a hindrance than a help. For a lot of people, they would rather let the future take its course, leave it up to the hands of a higher power, use whatever kind of analogy or cliche you want. But the bottom line is that information in this case is more paralyzing than helpful. And so having access to information is something we need to consider because, again, for some it's very useful, it's beneficial, and for others it could may mean a lifetime of guilt whatever decision they make in the long run. Now, I mentioned to you before that this is an issue which covers many of our key ideas here. And one of the first ideas I want you to think about is this issue and its importance in relation to the idea of genetic diversity. First of all, who can tell me here what genetic diversity is and why it's so important?
Like a variety of genotypes in a population.
So it has to deal with a variety of genotypes within a population, and why is it important to have?
Because without it, the human species would become extinct. Without the natural selection.
So a variety of genes within the human population is considered critical for human survival. That is because, let's say, a disease were to run through the human population. It impacted a large number of people. If all of those people, for instance, the entire species had the same genes, it would wipe out the population, it would make the population extinct. That is why variety is key. And of course, today, many people have different kinds of genetic traits that might appear to be negative, but down the road might be in fact crucial for survival. We have absolutely no idea what the long-term consequences of decisions might be. And that is an idea, unintended consequences, long-term consequences, that we need to keep thinking about time and time again in each of our stories. In the story of the genetic testing of pregnant women, when or how could genetic diversity be put at risk?
Because they choose women or families who choose what their genes to choose from the pool. So they would like to have height. They would like to have.
Well, that goes more towards the germline gene therapy. Let's think about just this process itself. How could this process impact genetic diversity?
Well, when it comes to sex selection, couldn't that balance the population?
We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But more generally speaking,
It's kind of similar to eugenics, really, because you're trying to eliminate certain genes so you can have the desirable genes be passed on. I don't know.
okay, so maybe we'll just make it even more basic. If, for instance, a particular genetic trait or genetic disease in our society is seen as negative, you might see an increase of terminations. And over time, this impacts genetic diversity because you're eliminating these traits within the general population.
Yeah, you might find down the road that actually there's a plus side to those genes that we hadn't acknowledged yet.
That's exactly what we said before, unintended consequences.
Could also be a benefit, that we could wipe out that disease forever.
It could, but now let's talk, for example, about what ends up happening in this process of genetic diversity. The idea of the individual decision-making process and long-term consequences for the human population. Now, as has sort of been suggested here, one of the major issues where we actually see this happening is in the area of sex selection. Over the last decade or so, we know that the technology has been available for many families to know, for instance, the gender of their baby before, for example, the pregnancy is complete. And yet, knowing the gender of one's baby ahead of time has resulted in many countries around the world in the termination of pregnancies, especially when, for example, the baby is to be born female. We know this because in many countries around the world, there is still this idea, culturally speaking, of boys being preferred over girls. And when we look at some countries in particular, in the case, for instance, of China and India, many studies have now shown exactly what kind of negative impact this has had. For instance, in China and India, when we consider the gender ratio of boys to girls, in some of the more rural areas within both of these populations, the ratio is not normally the 1-to-1 that we would consider. In some cases, it's actually 1 to every 25 or 35. One female to every 25 or 35 males. And psychologists and sociologists and researchers have pointed out then how this has impacted each population. A rise, for example, in kidnappings, in rapes, in suicides, more gang violence, more higher rates of depression, just to name a few. All of which are a result of this gender skew. Who can tell me here the links of these ideas I just talked about with the gender skew? Who can tell me the connection? When you have more men than women in a population, for example, why do you see an increase in kidnapping?
Some might argue the population gets more violent.
Well, part of it is the population gets more violent, but think of these areas as places where women are considered to be what?
Oh, I was just gonna say that there could be an issue of like not finding your mate.
Yeah. Not finding a mate, women are considered commodities. If there's not enough commodities to go around, you take the commodities as opposed to anything else.
Women are also less respected.
less respected and less valued, so the concept of kidnapping becomes quite commonplace, and it's been happening as we speak. Higher incidents of rape are pretty self-explanatory. When there are less females to go around, men tend to go around in packs, and you start to see higher levels of gang violence. It's clear. This is all documented stuff. Higher levels of gang violence.
Well, yeah, and even like think about even when it's a 1-to-1 ratio, how many like fights and stuff are over, you know, guys will fight each other over a girl. If there's 25 guys fighting for one girl, that destroys the community. They're not like friends anymore. There's nobody helping each other out because they need each other because they're all stealing each other.
Well, destruction of the community is quite common, and actually it's got some really negative results. Higher rates of suicide being one. Higher rates of depression being another. Higher rates of prostitution.
I just want to make a comment that I was watching this TV show in India, the female infanticide has been on a rise, that people at very remote places, they're auctioning off girls.
Sure, it's a part of this process where women are devalued, but they're scarce. So they don't necessarily become a more precious commodity, they just become,
So they kidnap them and they auction them off.
they do more negative things.
Well, on top of that, I think some of these families are auctioning off their child because in these countries, dowry is just a thing. So basically, having a female child would later on when she gets married, the family who is in poor economic status would have to pay a dowry. So rather than having a child, why not have the child be auctioned off for the economy and get a profit instead of making a loss?
Sure. It's economics, and just think of the economic arguments we've been talking about so far. But here is where I really want you to think of those long-term consequences I talked about. 10 years ago and 15 years ago, people started making these choices with the availability of the technology. Families started making these choices. But of course, this was an individual family decision. And yet, every single individual family decision over time has this worldwide impact. People don't realize that the net result of these actions can have such negative long-term consequences. And yet, this is very evident when we talk about something like sex selection. So if this is the case, when we talk then again about genetic diversity, we talk about a greater availability of tests, and using these tests, for example, to select other traits, we can get into equally problematic territory. That leads us to the slippery slope. Slippery slope arguments in particular. When we talk about slippery slope arguments, who can here tell me what a slippery slope argument is?
The idea that something really small can lead to a chain of events causing a really big outcome.
Yeah, so it's about the decision-making process. Let's say you make a decision based on information you have at hand, you feel comfortable about this decision, and more importantly, you feel in control of this decision. And yet, over time, things happen, new information is gathered, and all of a sudden you no longer have control over the decision-making process like you did before. You are now on this quote-unquote slippery slope. A slippery slope implies, for instance, a lack of control. And it can often mean, for instance, starting off feeling in control, but ending up feeling anything but in control. When we think then about slippery slope arguments in terms of this whole issue, especially in relation to genetic diversity, we have to consider a number of things. For example, depending on what part of the world again you live in, depending on what kind of country, for instance, you live in, when we think about accessing these techniques, think about another issue equally important. That issue, of course, being who has the right to decide what genetic traits and what genetic diseases are those which constitute termination. Which of those, for instance, are those genetic traits that we still want to remain with us in society? We know we live in a world where sometimes that is going to fall to the individual, and other times it's going to fall to the government itself to make this kind of decision. And all of a sudden, consider this whole problem of what actually constitutes a genetic disease in the first place. In fact, what constitutes a disease in the first place? That is something that is still very much up for debate. A great example that I can give of that, to show you, for instance, the complexity of this issue, takes us to the deaf community. Now, for instance, if I were to tell you that you were likely to become deaf over time, you would probably see this in a negative way. You would see deafness as a disease, which of course would be something you want to fix. Yet if you were to go to the deaf community, they would greatly resent this idea. Those within the deaf community often state that their deafness is not a disease, it is in fact just a part of who they are. And they greatly resent the implication that what they have is a negative quality that needs a cure. As a result, one of the new technologies, not new now, but one of the relatively new technologies out there is something called a cochlear implant. Cochlear implants can be put in the ear. They allow a better chance of hearing, successive hearing, and they are used predominantly on children. Well, again, if you had a child who was deaf, you'd probably want them to use a cochlear implant to help them fit in with society. But cochlear implants are viewed with very mixed reaction within the deaf community. In the deaf community, if two parents are deaf, they live in a community where everybody else is deaf, their employers are deaf, you get the idea. All of a sudden, if you put a cochlear implant on a child within this community, that actually makes the child more different than the same. And the idea then of curing the child of deafness makes it appear that deafness is a negative quality, which is something they would contest very vigorously. So think about deafness all of a sudden as being a contested, quote-unquote, trait or disease. And all of a sudden, think, for instance, of living in a society where we have to start figuring out what are acceptable traits for termination and what are those we want to keep. And think of the slippery slope that comes when we again get into this idea of termination. Yes, perhaps many of us would see, for instance, the value of terminating a pregnancy if you knew that your child was going to get a life-threatening, debilitating disease where their chances of suffering were great. But that is a very different thing from finding out, for example, your child might be missing a finger or a limb. So where do you draw the line? Who draws the line? And who has the ability to make those decisions? Again, not futuristic, far-off stuff, things we need to consider right now as the technology becomes more readily available to us. Let's look at issue number 3. Issue number 3 is probably the most well-known debate. You'll read about it in many different disciplines, and it's all about nature versus nurture. Now, the nature versus nurture debate is again this debate of whether or not people are a product of their genes, which is the nature side, or whether or not they are more a product of their environment, which of course is the nurture side. Now, we talked a great deal about this debate in some last class. For example, what particular group of individuals did we talk about last class that would fall clearly on the side of nature? The eugenicists. When we talk about the eugenics movement, we are talking about a group who would clearly be on the side of nature, believing that everything is genetically determined. And that takes us, of course, to that idea of genetic determinism that I want you to consider. What is genetic determinism? It is the prevailing idea associated with the nature side of the debate.
Say what you said again. What were you asking?
What is genetic determinism, and why is this the prevailing belief on the nature side of the debate?
The idea that we're made up by everything that's in us, and the composition becomes who we are. We have a right to determine what happens to that genetic nature, where we're going to go with it.
Well, that's almost environment when we have the right to determine. Genetic determinism says there's only one thing that determines who we are. Our genetics determine it. Our genetics determine every facet of who we are. Our appearance, our personality, our general traits, our general characteristics, everything is determined by genes and genes alone. This is what genetic determinism is really all about.
When I was looking up genetic determinism, they've actually, like from what I've seen is that they've changed it. The definition now is including both.
Well, it's including both probably because it's a very clear-cut one-sided idea, but initially,
It was.
determinism is, that's what it is. When you talk about determinism, you're talking about genes and genes alone being the sole factor. I have a feeling that the reason why they sort of tried to make it more, change it or make it more inclusive is because of its links to things like eugenics. And its links to things, for example, that are quite controversial when you start focusing on genes alone.
There was a gentleman here across his genesis named Donald Hebb, and he described it like a rectangle. He'd say which more important, the length or the width, but you need both to make the rectangle.
And that is usually the reaction most people have. When you ask them, are people a product of genes? Are people a product of their environment? The most likely reaction people have is both. They say there's a mixture of both. But again, let's look at theory versus reality. Because in many cases, although people will say that individuals are a product of both, when we think about the common language we use, when we think about some of the common phrases and sayings that we have, they often appear to show us something very different. For instance, you know of a family where their children are getting into a lot of trouble perhaps, they're not doing so well, and all of a sudden you hear phrases like, well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You start to hear these kinds of ideas which suggest that in reality, people don't always necessarily point to environment as much as they do to nature. But what I want you to think about next is how important this nature versus nurture argument is. When we talk about now attempting to link certain types of traits to one's genetic makeup. There is a great deal of controversy and even research being done in society today about this very issue. Linking things, for example, like alcoholism or obesity to genetics. And there's one issue in particular that I want you to think about, as again highlighting both the pros and cons of this type of research. Sexual preference. There's a great deal of research being done today about one's sexual preference. Whether or not something, for instance, like homosexuality is linked to one's genetic makeup. This idea is not, for example, an area of research where there is consensus. Researchers do not still know the clear-cut answer to this issue. But what I want you to consider is what would happen in society if there was this kind of connection. If we live in a world where down the road, people are able to link homosexuality or one's sexual preference to one's genetic makeup, I want you to think about both the benefits as well as the drawbacks this could bring about. So now, instead of talking about viewpoints, what we're going to do is look at pros and cons. And let's start with the pros. What or how might people benefit in society if scientists were one day to make a clear-cut connection between genes and sexual preference?
The acceptance of it.
So the acceptance of it by who?
By society, that it's not the gay person's fault that they're gay, it's just the way they are.
So it's what's the word there?
It's kind of like balance.
It's no longer considered a
It's a choice. It's a
choice.
to the point, it becomes a discrimination because they can't determine to be gay or not. It's the chemical imbalance inside their body with their genetics that make them gay. So once you discriminate them because of their sexuality, that's like crimes against humanity.
Well, it would not necessarily be chemical imbalance, it would just be genetics. And then all of a sudden here, let's talk about this idea of choice. You live in a world where all of a sudden many religious institutions and many individuals who promote or highlight the concept of choice no longer can make this claim. They can no longer say your sexual preference is a choice. And all of a sudden, you might see, on the part of at least some, a greater acceptance and growing awareness and education, for example, that these are kinds of things, for instance, that are inherent to an individual as opposed to a choice of anything else. And that, of course, then takes us to the issue of genetic discrimination. Because if you are now linking sexual preference to genetics, you are now claiming that if you are discriminated against as a result of your sexual preference, it falls into this category of genetic discrimination, and all of a sudden, what kinds of institutions are more likely to become involved?
Religion, because it is no longer a sin to be gay.
Well, there's more acceptance there, but what kinds of institutions are much more likely to become involved with this issue of discrimination? Government institutions, political institutions, legal institutions. Think of issues like gay marriage, denying insurance rights, denying, for example, basic spousal rights, which still happens in many places around the world as a result of one's sexual preference. All of a sudden, it would be much more likely or harder to do these kinds of things if we are talking about a form of genetic discrimination. And yet, in reality, like we just talked about before, there's always going to be discrimination in the world. There are always going to be those who do not accept another's sexual preference if it is different from them, and are those who are going to continue to see this as a negative thing. And all of a sudden, if you link genetics to sexual preference in this way, and it is still viewed as a negative thing, what are some people going to call it? They're going to call it a disease. And what are they going to try to do with that disease? Cure it. So you have that negative side to think about as well. Now, another issue which we explored on Tuesday is that issue of race and intelligence. We spent a great deal of our time debunking those racial prejudices associated with these tests. We talked a lot about, for instance, the problems of these early intelligence tests. And yet, we talked about them in a time, for example, of the early 20th century. Yet, as many of you know today, there are still some of those who promote these differences to be found in the area of race and intelligence. And it's an area that I asked you to think about when looking at our good friend James Watson, who was able to manage to find out what James Watson said about 3 or 4 years ago now about race and intelligence.
I think he said something about how people from African American descent are less intelligent than people from European descent.
Well, he doesn't talk about African Americans, he talks about the continent of Africa. James Watson was giving a speech, or he was being asked a series of questions after giving a speech. And one of the questions he was asked by a reporter was how he felt about a lot of money and funding going into the continent of Africa to raise, for example, levels of education and social awareness. And what James Watson said at this time was that he believed investing in Africa was a waste. And he saw it as a complete waste because he believed that inherently those in Africa are less intelligent than those in other parts of the world. So he made a clear cut, for example, connection or distinction again between race and intelligence, basically implying a genetic inferiority on the part of the African population. Now, first of all, think about this. James Watson did not say this in the 1950s or the 1960s. He said it 3 or 4 years ago. What do you think happened to James Watson when he made those claims? He was ridiculed, he was shamed, he was socially ostracized.
He lost his integrity.
He lost a lot of his integrity within the scientific community because the scientific community was very quick to point out the fact that everything James Watson was saying was wrong, especially the leading scientists in the field of intelligence research. The reason why they were so quick to move themselves or distance themselves away from James Watson is because if you know anything in the field of intelligence theory today, you will recognize that what they believe now is that there are actually far fewer differences in intelligence between people of different races than there actually are differences amongst people of the same race. That is where the research is as we currently speak. So James Watson was saying things, for example, that were scientifically unsound. He became a social pariah almost overnight, lost many of his prime speaking engagements, his prime positions in the scientific community, tried to apologize, of course, a couple of days later, and didn't do what I said, but of course, by then, a bit too late. We already know of James Watson and his problems from our earlier story of Rosalind Franklin and the race to find the structure of DNA. If you read a little bit more about James Watson, you will know he's actually a closet eugenicist. But, not so much closet actually. But, I want you to now think about the significance and somewhat negative significance associated with James Watson's comments. Again, touching upon, for instance, what happens when we start to consider science as a value-free enterprise. What is, for instance, the big problem with someone like James Watson making those claims on race and intelligence, even though we know them to be completely and utterly false.
He's an authority figure. People believe what he's saying for that simple fact.
He's an authority figure, and not just any authority figure, the co-discoverer of DNA, the most important discovery of the 20th century. So for a lot of individuals, when James Watson says something, what are they likely to do? They're likely to believe it, knowing nothing of his own biases and prejudices, which are inherent in a lot of his own scientific thinking. And by that, we can start to think about, for instance, what kind of negative impact this could have. Because if James Watson comes on the radio or on television, and he starts saying these ideas about race and intelligence, well, yes, maybe a couple of days later, he refutes them. But a lot of times people see the first, they don't necessarily see the retraction. They only get that first piece of information, which makes them believe, well, if James Watson said it, then maybe there's some truth to it. Maybe it's something that we need to consider or believe. Now, this is something I want you to consider, especially in our story of genetic research. Because genetic research is full of these controversies, and we've already seen them historically, where issues of gender bias and racial bias, cultural bias can clearly come into play. So perhaps there is no other field where we really need to debunk this issue of value-free science as much as this particular area. But before the break, the last thing I want you to think about is that when we look at this whole nature versus nurture debate, especially, for instance, in today's world, one of the things to consider is that the leading or newest field of research in this area is a field called epigenetics. And for those of you who have never heard of epigenetics, consider it the following. Epigenetics is actually a field of research which now says that a woman who is pregnant, the genes of that fetus can actually be impacted by the environment in which she lives. It puts a whole new twist on nature versus nurture. So when we look at this whole idea of the nature versus nurture debate, understand that for a long time it was sort of this clear-cut idea, but new fields and new studies like epigenetics show us something very different. All right, let's take our first break, come back in about 10-15 minutes or so, and we will conclude. Came in late, don't forget to sign in. So the next topic that we're going to be looking at is the topic of germline gene therapy. And as I mentioned to you on Tuesday, it really involves the ability or techniques which are used to genetically alter a fetus so that you can, for example, add or remove certain characteristics. You can remove, for instance, a particular degenerative genetic disease, or you have the potential to alter characteristics such as hair and eye color. And it is why, for instance, germline gene therapy has been called the ability to create designer babies. So just like we did with the nature versus nurture ideas, we want to explore this particular issue from a pro and con perspective. And so the first thing that I want you to consider are some of the reasons why parents might want to use these techniques on their children. Why, for instance, would parents see a benefit to a technique like germline gene therapy? So with the diseases, you have, for instance, the ability to actually eliminate the disease within future generations because it's not going to pop up again. So for something like germline gene therapy, for a lot of parents, it would be about giving their children a better quality of life, eliminating a particular disease that they would see again cause a lot of harm and suffering.
And then same way, better quality of life, get tailored to the society considered a bother.
So for some parents, they might say that giving or altering a child's, let's say, hair color or eye color or appearance might be a way of giving their children one step ahead or putting their children one step ahead of everyone else, allowing them, for example, better chances for opportunity or success in life.
You could also design a child to be more athletic or more music enabled or whatever way you want.
So sometimes it's about a parent's preference. Maybe they want, for instance, again, a child who is more musically inclined or who's more athletic, and they believe using these techniques is one way, for instance, of creating a child designed or tailored to their own needs. So there are reasons why we can use these kinds of techniques, and you can clearly see that for the most part, perhaps with the exception of the last idea, that generally speaking it is to ensure a better quality of life for the child. The last argument is more about the parent itself and maybe what they prefer or want. Now, however, let's talk a little bit about some of those cons associated with germline gene therapy. And there are a few to consider, of course.
Well, obviously, it affects genetic diversity, and you're narrowing
So unintended consequences, long-term consequences, if you limit or you limit diversity within the genetic pool, if consistently certain genetic traits are eliminated, then you really see this idea, for instance, of not knowing what's going to happen down the road or in the future. So that's an important point.
Well, one ethical issue would be happening with autonomy. When the kid grows up, well, let's say the parents, they want the kid to have some musical ability, but when he grows up, he's going to want to make his own choices.
So let's talk about that individual response where again we see that 50-50 scenario. Now for some children, if they were to learn that they were genetically enhanced or genetically altered, this might bring about feelings that you talked about before, the issue of genetic superiority. Maybe they feel that they're better than everyone else. Maybe they feel, for instance, that their quality of life is better than others. And in that sense, for instance, they are quite happy with the idea of being genetically altered. But that is not necessarily true for everyone. What is another possible reaction to finding out you've been genetically altered?
But what if you are, let's say you were like almost at the top of your music career and you find someone else that is also as equally as good as you or maybe even better, but like you're the one who's genetically modified and he's not. So it's just like you're pitting yourself against him. It's not really your own ability, it's your genetically modified ability. So you might look down on yourself that you're just made the way you are. You're not,
It's no, you had no choice.
You have no talents.
Well, you had no choice, not even no, you might not have any talent, maybe you're not necessarily even comparing yourself to someone else.
You don't consider your choices kind of thing, because you're modified to do that, whereas you could have chose to do that.
So for a lot of people, maybe the traits, characteristics they've been given are not necessarily those that they would want for themselves. Maybe they end up feeling, for instance, that the who I am is really not who I am. Feeling uncomfortable in their own skin, so to speak. If teenagers already have identity issues, imagine the kinds of identity issues that come with genetic alteration. And perhaps even most importantly, if you find out your parents genetically altered you in some aspect, what might you think your parents thought of you?
Talk about it like over a domineering parent.
Well, domineering in one hand,
But you might feel like your parents didn't love you for who you were, and that's why they had to genetically, kind of like almost like mutate you into something better.
they didn't think you were good enough to begin with. So when you think about this, a lot of people often, and this usually comes from popular media and culture, where you have that genetic superiority or feelings of genetic superiority. But again, in reality, the likelihood of people having negative feelings associated with being genetically altered are actually those we need to consider. Also consider this idea of changing one's appearance. Your parents, for example, might live in a society where having red hair and having brown eyes are considered the epitome of beauty. And perhaps they want you, their child, to have those same characteristics. What, however, do we know happens often over time? Trends change. So especially with something like physical features, what might appear to be an epitome of beauty in one generation might be completely the opposite in another. So again, unintended consequences are what we need to consider. also go back to this notion of parents believing they can alter your athleticism, maybe your ability to love music, or your intelligence on the basis of these kinds of techniques. What, again, is there an inherent assumption of?
You're gonna like it.
Well, not just you're going to like it, but
You're gonna excel at it.
not just you're going to excel at it. Then you're going to go back to nature versus nurture.
Oh, you're only gonna do that?
Not necessarily.
That your genes like, no matter what, will make you a better athlete when really, like, the environment has a lot to do with it.
There is this idea of genetic determinism, very much evident in germline gene therapy techniques. The assumption that genes and genes alone can determine your intelligence, your athleticism, things we don't necessarily believe in today. So the idea then of creating a child using germline gene therapy techniques has a lot of problems associated with it. And let's think about some others we haven't even talked about here. Economic, religious. What might be an economic issue?
If you get rid of certain diseases in a population or in a society, that you're spending less money on like research or treatments or whatever.
Well, you might end up spending more money because you're coming up with new problems, but economically, think about the techniques themselves.
So if it's deemed acceptable, it's going to be high cost and only about relatively people would be able to access.
Sure, it's cost prohibitive. For many people, they cannot necessarily undergo these kinds of tests and techniques. You might, in fact, make these techniques might only become available for the wealthy, and because they are now linked with economic status, you start to see a greater idea of the have and have-nots, genetically superior and inferior, not necessarily because of the genetics, but because it is associated with economics.
There could be a lot of benefits to it. You could do this and give everybody cognitive increase, everybody in the world. It could be a much better place. We could solve a lot of the problems. Figure out more about the DNA, genes, what they do.
Well, some would say the exact opposite. If you live in a world where everyone, for example, now has higher levels of intelligence, maybe now you live in a world where people refuse to do certain kinds of work they see if they need them. They start to see, for example, the things that others should do. Creating, for example, yes.
We'll get it right eventually.
I think people view that as ignorance, and then it's because people are not so educated or they're not as smart as others. They feel that, like, I don't know, it's like this ignorance about, like you said before, you call it ignorance. I just feel that people who see people who like people of the other gender, their sexuality, and hate on their sexuality, it's because of ignorance.
Sure.
And so if you change your genetics to be different and to be smarter, like I think some of that ignorance would go away.
Well, intelligence and ignorance are two totally different things. We have to think about. There are a lot of ignorant, intelligent people out
Yeah,
there.
but it could be a better understanding of simple moral rights and wrongs too.
Well, again, but there's an assumption there that intelligence brings about that kind of enlightenment. And we've seen many cases throughout history where that is far from the case.
And also it's based on opinion, like who's intelligence, maybe some people are really against like homosexuality, for example, and they can develop a way of thinking that it's bad and continue to.
It's the way you use your intelligence. It's very much evident here. There are no doubt there are benefits to the techniques, but at the same time, as we said, there are a lot of drawbacks. And when we talk about popular culture in society, it is often those kinds of general images of the haves and have-nots, superior, inferior, that come about, and not necessarily these more sort of individual factors that we need to take into account. What about religion?
The idea of people playing God.
Playing God, that is a big one for a lot of people. The idea, for instance, that you are inherently changing characteristics, you are playing God, you are doing things, for example, that are against, for instance, your particular religious philosophies or beliefs. This might prevent a lot of people from engaging or using these techniques.
Like, some religious groups have been known to stop child care for their children or whatever, because it goes against their religion, and then the government or like judges have come to like to, overturn that parental decision. So are we gonna do this with germline gene therapy, or are we gonna
Well, let's
where are we drawing the line there?
Yeah, where do you draw the line? And let's go that, make that a bigger issue. Certain countries allow these techniques, other countries don't. You live in a country that doesn't allow these techniques. What are you creating? create them for the organ market as it is, what do we call those markets? Black markets. You start to create black markets, opportunities, for example, to allow these techniques or to have these techniques in places where they are illegal.
I was just gonna say about the religious thing, if God did create the world and we're capable of doing this, what's to say that wasn't his design?
And that would be part of that religious debate that would sort of recycle itself over and over again. Cloning. Let's talk a little bit about cloning. Now, cloning is an interesting issue with both pros and cons. Lots of different arguments to consider. Hopefully some you've thought of, others maybe you haven't. And again, we're going to start with the benefits. What are some benefits to cloning? Here, we're not talking about human hormones like we did last class. We're talking about humans. The ability to clone animals and the ability to clone plant life. See you then.
Hi, everyone.
Keep waiting. Some more. Great. So let's now look at this issue of genetic cloning. Now, the idea of cloning, as I said, can be discussed from many different angles, especially when we talk about cloning plant, human, or animal life. And again, let's start with some of the positives associated with cloning. What are some of the things that we as a society could do if these cloning techniques were to be used in different ways?
So they should clone organs and have them available for transplant.
So for a lot of individuals, it's about cloning organs. Organs, for instance, are scarce in our world. There is an increasing shortage of organs, creating these black markets we've talked about. The ability to clone organs, for instance, might increase chances of survival for many people if, for instance, these techniques were to be used.
If you look at it through the viewpoint of military, you can have cloning wars.
What is it, Star Wars?
Well, let's expand this a little bit to make it less futuristic, but think about the idea of cloning different people to do different jobs in society. Perhaps those, for instance, that people don't necessarily want to do. When you actually think about cloning for the military, the idea of using clones as opposed to actual people is considered by many to be a huge benefit.
Yeah, won't that just create a slave society?
We'll talk about that as a negative in just a few minutes.
I got a lot of.
I was gonna say, to be at two places at once, in the sense that, like, for example, in families that don't have kids, who's better to, take over, other than yourself?
Well, let's talk about this more generally again.
I want myself to take
And
over.
the idea itself can be looked at both positively and negatively, but for some it would be positive. Think about cloning oneself for the purposes of immortality, which a lot of people are very fascinated with. There have been those who talk about the cloning of past loved ones, including, for instance, children who have died, and the ability to clone. Cloning pets has been also seen as a way, for instance, of bringing back the loss of a loved pet in this case.
Is your conscious they won't transfer over, right?
And again, we'll come back to that when we talk about religious issues and others. Guys, too much chatter. Make sure we're writing everything down.
Texas A&M University is working with University in Africa. They're creating a goat through cloning and germline that has the malaria vaccine actually in the milk. So as people would drink the milk, they actually automatically get the vaccine.
So there's a number of things you can do. You can clone species for instance, medicinal purposes. But again, you can even clone species for food purposes, for increasing your food supply. Cloning plants, cloning animals, and the like. There's a big debate out there that whether or not we live in a world where food is actually scarce or whether or not it's more about politics and economics. But nevertheless, people are starving. There is a need for more food supplies and more food sources. Cloning is seen by many as a way of doing that. What's another area associated with animals which might benefit from cloning?
To clone the extinct animals and bring them back.
Extinct or endangered animals, there are seen as benefits to cloning those as well.
Well, when you clone extinct animals, you gotta think of like the effect that would have on the current the chain of like, the processing chain of like, environment.
Guys, there should not be talking going on when one person is talking. I apologize. Guys,
Like, let's say, for example, like the intelligence, like the members up north, where if you clone those back, like, where would you put them? And then how would that affect, like, the environment it's put in? Like,
So-
put it back in, like, North America or
So
something?
unintended consequences. It goes back to unintended consequences and in fact some of the negatives that can come out of using these techniques, which we've seen time and time again. So let's now look at that other side. When we talk, for instance, about some of the drawbacks of cloning, you just mentioned one. For instance, you clone the idea of animal species, but you don't necessarily know how those species are going to adapt to a new environment. Let's go back to the other point that was mentioned. With cloning, say you live in a world where people you start to clone humans to do particular jobs in society, things that other people don't want to do. This leads, of course, though, then to the question of ownership. If one individual clones another, they are put as ownership over another. You're talking about clones being property, and then, of course, you are, in fact, talking about clones being, in essence, slaves. That's a huge legal issue to consider.
They could also be farmed for their organs.
Well, farm for organs, where again, you see unintended consequences, because a lot of the times, if you're cloning from species where, for instance, the organs were degenerative to begin with, who's to say that those new organs that are cloned are not necessarily going to come out the same way?
Overpopulation.
Oh. Yeah, overpopulation is a major idea to consider, and go to the notion again of people who want to clone themselves for immortality purposes, they want to clone their pet, they want to clone the lost of a loved one. What's the inherent assumption here that we know by now is not necessarily true? That the clone is going to be exactly the same. The assumption that that loved one you've lost is going to be an exact replica of what you've lost, when we know right away, based on our past discussions, this is not necessarily the case. Think of other legal issues. Think of the world we live in now. How do people get convicted? What's the primary basis for convictions?
DNA, fingerprinting, and all that stuff.
DNA and fingerprinting, but DNA which is based on the concept of what? Unique DNA. The reason you can assure a conviction is because your DNA is different from anyone else's. With cloning, that goes out the window. And all of a sudden, your entire legal system can turn upside down.
Well, actually, fingerprinting is still unique because where you are positioned from your fetus determines like your fingerprint. So even if you're at home, your fingerprint is not exactly the same as home.
No, it's very true, but for a lot of people, the conviction is not based on fingerprints. When people use gloves, for example, to commit murders and such, it's based on hair follicles.
Well, that's still true because like identical twins still have the same genetic makeup. So sometimes you could incarcerate a twin instead of the actual person. So like, that's still a viable fact. So clones
Add to that. They add to a very small community by making it larger.
If a clone is exactly you, then what would it say, wouldn't you have to stop the clone from committing crimes? I say throw both of them in jail.
Well, the idea of ownership again comes into issue with who's responsible. If you live in a world where there's a responsibility. What else? Think religion, there's a big one here for cloning. Why is religion such a big issue with cloning? Two different reasons.
It's not God's creation.
So it's playing God. I mean playing God in even a more fundamental way for some than germline gene therapy, but there's another debate.
It's because of its emphasis on the soul.
Souls, conscious, the idea of whether or not clones actually have souls. What's another debate to consider here? It's another argument.
Most of the pregnancies that come from cloning don't actually come from pregnancy.
So let's look at that. Let's look at the techniques that are used. First of all, what was the first animal ever cloned?
Dolly.
Dolly. What happened to Dolly? Dolly died. Dolly died from what?
She died from a disease which was common in old sheep, but she was only 6 years old.
So the techniques of the cloning itself, we don't know what the end result is going to be. So with cloning, you come across another issue that has in many ways the same kind of outcomes we've talked about before. Think about the economics again. Cloning is expensive. Who's going to have the ability to access these cloning techniques? Think of the opportunities of creating the black markets that we've talked about before. And more importantly, again, think of the world we live in, where different countries have very different philosophies, where some, for instance, will use these techniques Others might see more harm than good coming from these techniques. And you are creating areas, for instance, where there is very much of a gray zone associated with how these techniques will be incorporated and how they're going to be managed and controlled. So that was a very good discussion. And what I'd like you to think of next are two case studies. Now, the two case studies that I want you to think about were two case studies about genetic research which happened in the US in the 1980s and early 90s, but which we are called precedent-setting cases, both within that country and worldwide. What's a precedent-setting case? Well, once a case sets a precedent, all other cases after it are going to fall in accordance with that decision. So a precedent-setting case is really the first of its kind and can have a major and huge impact down the road. That takes us to the first case we want to talk about in 1980, Diamond versus Chakrabarty. Now, Chakrabarty was a microbiologist, and what he was the first person to do was to create, what he created first was in fact a genetically modified living organism. So he was creating a genetically modified living thing. In the case of Chakrabarty, what he ended up creating was a microbe, a single-celled living organism, which had the ability at the time to absorb oil. And the idea, of course, was that it could be used in things like oil spills. Now, when Chakrabarty went to the United States Patent Office to file a patent on this microbe, he was at first denied. Because up until this time, the US Patent Office had rejected any patents associated with patenting living things. And yet, after this case went to the US Supreme Court, they rejected the US Patent Office's decision and sided in favor of Chakrabarty, allowing for the first time the ability to patent a living organism. Now, when we talk about precedent setting, we really need to think of the long-term consequences here. While most of us would probably not really think twice about the idea of genetically modifying a single-cell microbe and then patenting it, what's happened down the road is far more debatable. It takes us to the 1980s, for instance, when researchers in the US patented something called the Harvard mouse. The Harvard mouse was, again, a genetically modified mouse that was designed to develop cancer in very early, in a very fast way, so that it could be used in cancer research. And yet, when a patent was obtained on the Harvard mouse, the cancer community was up in arms, saying, for instance, that this patent actually hindered, as opposed to helped, cancer research down the road. Why would they make this claim?
Because other people wouldn't be able to research using that same mouse.
They wouldn't be able to research it without paying a royalty, making cancer costs actually go higher as opposed to decrease. Now, interestingly, when the Harvard mouse came to Canada, the Canadian government at the time rejected it, showing us, again, different countries having very different views on this phenomenon. But what I want you to consider then is this idea of genetically modified living organisms and the ability to patent them in the 21st century. The notion of patenting microbes, the notion of patenting mice is one thing to consider. But as we live in a world where the techniques become more advanced, genetically modified species as a whole become now at issue. And because of this precedent-setting case, you are setting a standard for, again, where we now have to deal with these very unforeseen consequences that people really did not think about 10 or 20 years ago. So it's a really interesting issue, and one I want you to consider as part of our modern-day genetic research controversies. The second issue is probably going to split the room in terms of agreeing or disagreeing. And that legal case has to do with a man named John Moore versus the University of California. Now, in the late 80s, early 90s, John Moore, he had some spleen trouble, and he was requiring surgery. So what he ended up doing was going to the University of California to get his spleen removed. The University of California, just like the University of Toronto, however, is a research hospital. And so he was well aware of the fact that they might in fact do some research with his tissue samples if he were to have his surgery here. However, what ended up happening is that when John Moore went to the University of California, after his tissue samples were removed, the university actually found them to be unique enough to create cell lines, which they then patented. They ended up patenting John Moore's cell lines, selling them to other researchers, but John Moore did not know this was happening. When John Moore found out that his cell lines were being patented, he demanded compensation, saying they were his cell lines. But he was refused compensation. This matter then went all the way up again to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a decision that might surprise you, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in favor of the university. They decided in favor of the university for two reasons. The first, they stated that once these samples left John Moore's body, they were no longer his property. And the second reason they also stated was because if they had to now label everything that was coming out of people's bodies, it would create chaos in terms of general research. Now this was very much a he said versus they said debate. John Moore claimed the university had lied to them at one point. The university claimed otherwise. There was no written contract between them, which could have solved the issue quite easily. But it's all about now property rights. Is what is inside your body actually yours? Is it your own property when it leaves your body? And you can imagine the kinds of debates that these lawyers would have had in front of the Supreme Court. Because there are many instances, for instance, where we talk about different property rights within different opportunities. Think, for example, of your garbage. Your garbage is your own until when? Until it hits the curb. So if you leave something valuable in that garbage, it's no longer yours. It's no longer your property. Conversely, think of the following. If I'm walking down this road and one of you takes the opportunity to saw off my hand drops on the floor, you pick it up, and then you run away with it. Is it no longer my property? Or, it's on the floor, it's somebody else's altogether. When we think about property right arguments, they're really interesting. They even go to issues, for instance, like sperm donations, that kind of thing. When does your property cease to be your own? And in the case of John Moore, what made people think it's a very unfair, of course, decision was that he was never given any money for what was essentially his material. Others said, well, John Moore was just greedy. He would have never done anything with the material anyway. So what makes this an issue? It's a huge issue because it's all about property and genetic rights, and it's something that we all need to consider as well. So are there any questions about our 5 modern-day genetic research controversies or our 2 legal case studies before I start talking to you about your final exam? And also give you information about your marks and such. Alright, so a few things. First of all, I have finished marking your exams. However, I still got to get through a couple from the other class, which means that your marks will be posted online by tomorrow at the latest. So you'll get your marks, I'll bring back the exams, and then you'll be able to pick them up on Tuesday. In terms of your final overall marks, I think I mentioned it in this class, but I'll repeat myself one more time. In terms of your final marks for your papers and for your final exam, after the exam is over, I spend the next couple of weeks marking everything, handing it over to the register. At this time, please do not email me. When I have done everything, I will email you, and I will give you a window. And I will give you a window where you can email me for about a week, and I will give you a mark breakdown of your essay and your exam. So the only thing you're doing following the exam is to look for that email that comes from me, and then you can email me accordingly. Are there any questions about that?
How about the 10% participation?
That comes with that whole mark breakdown. But you should know where you stand with participation. If you've been coming to class, you give me the 2 assignments, you're pretty much assured of a pretty high mark. Okay, now in terms of the last exam on Tuesday, we will be starting at 1:45, so again, make sure that you're here by 1:30 at the very latest. You will have 2 hours to write this exam. Probably won't need as much time, but I'll just give it to you. And you will have 3 questions. 2 of your questions will be short answered. And as I mentioned on Tuesday, they're going to come from the discussion we had on Tuesday of historical genetic research controversies. So you will get 2 questions on either the race to find the structure of DNA, the beginnings of the Human Genome Project, or of course the eugenics movement, which we talked about. And then you'll have 1 long answer question based entirely on our discussion in class today. Reminders again, bring your ID, single space your answers, write on both length and line sides of the booklet. When you come in, make sure your phones are turned off, and I will sign you in before you start writing the exam so you're not disturbed. Are there any other questions? Yes?
Are these 2 cases on the test?
Those 2 cases will be part of the modern day genetic research. Yes?
Is that information online?
Yeah, everything here is online. Okay, if there are no questions, go ahead, go start studying, have a good weekend. I will see you on Tuesday.
Cut it out. Don't forget, I know you.
Right now,